You may remember in the Alberta election, a lot of things happened, but most notably in the lead up to it, we saw national headlines about one particular candidate from Calgary Mountain View, Caylan Ford, who ended up resigning as candidate because she says that her candidacy was becoming a distraction. The reason for that, as have been apparent in numerous articles, coverage that was linking her to some absolutely vile and egregious behaviors and ideologies, names that are so difficult to come back from that we'll talk about in a moment. But first, I want to welcome Caylan Ford. Caylan, thank you so much for talking to me today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm kind of going out on a limb, aren't I?
Well, you are and you aren't. I mean, the one thing that is, I would hope, freeing is that you're no longer a candidate, so you aren't restrained and the stakes are lower. But the downside of that is that you're no longer a candidate. This thing that you
That's
set
right.
out to do, you're not able to do. I want to avoid rehashing and relitigating things that have really now been a couple of months old. But I do
Yeah.
want to direct people to that because really this all started with a Press Progress article, and I'll read the headline. I'll put it up there. UCP candidate complained white supremacist terrorists are treated unfairly, leaked messages show. And then this, of course, triggers other media outlets that pick up because they don't want to be left behind here. And you fast forward a very short period of time and you're out of the race. And
Yeah,
one thing
four
that you,
hours basically. Like
yes,
it takes 4 hours from the time this thing is published in the evening, the night before the writ drop, to when I have resigned as a candidate.
and you were not really able to respond to the coverage itself and even to the coverage of the coverage until a couple of weeks later. And you put out a very lengthy, but I thought a very heartfelt piece. And you explained in really significant depth. I mean, a lot of the backstory between you and the person who leaked these messages, the context of what you were actually saying. But let me just say point blank, and I'm going to direct people to that because I think they need to read it really to understand where we're going to go from here. But the characterizations, not even of who you are, but the characterizations of what you said, how do you address those now? How do you respond to those?
Um, that's well, yeah. Where to start? Yeah, look, I'll give an example, and I know you said we don't want to relitigate all the details here, but I think it is worth talking about a little bit. The headline, they said that I claimed that white supremacist terrorists are treated unfairly. And this is based on a private conversation from 2 years ago with a person with whom I had sort of lengthy kind of intellectual discussions on a range of ideas. And as I recall the context, now I don't actually have records of these conversations, which is like one of the kind of torturous things about this, because I can't just provide the entire transcripts and let people see for themselves what was happening. I can't even see for myself what Press Progress edited and changed, though I learned later that they did in fact edit these comments. Um, but that came from a discussion where I said something to the effect that some aspects of our current approach to combating white supremacist terrorism and sort of radicalization are ineffective. And I think one of those ineffective tactics is when you see people who conflate any support for national borders, people who believe in orderly or controlled immigration, you see people conflating that with extremist ideas. Or people who recognize, for example, that a lot of Western countries are in the midst of quite a significant demographic transformation. Irrespective of the intended meaning or the conclusions that a person might draw from that or the significance they ascribe to that, merely mentioning these ideas is often seen as evidence that the person is somehow abhorrent and is sort of beyond the pale. And I think this is a really ineffective way of addressing radicalization. If anything, it seems likely to worsen those problems. It doesn't change people's minds when you call them racists, when you try to shame them for their beliefs. It doesn't change social facts when you try to forbid discussions of them. The more responsible thing in my mind is that you address them reasonably and responsibly. You acknowledge some of the issues that are going on and try to find ways to mitigate some of the problems that people might have with that, sometimes through education, sometimes in other ways. And this was taken then as evidence that I think that terrorists are treated unfairly. And then they kind of lined up the article subsequently to try to enforce that. So they pointed out, well, I didn't tweet about the Christchurch mosque massacre, as though sort of a failure to engage in performative grief is somehow evidence of the state of or the content of my soul, right? In fact, like I just don't tweet about current events that often, actually. And then sort of continued to pile on from there. They said, in one conversation I had referenced demographic replacement was the word I used, which admittedly was kind of puzzling language. And it was significant to me that that was one of the ones that I know that they'd edited. But this is a reference to the fact of high levels of international migration, of low birth rates and aging population that is in fact sort of quite significantly altering the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious profile, especially of countries in Western Europe. But they fixated on sort of the words used rather than the meaning and said, well, this sounds just like the manifesto of the shooter in Christchurch who killed 50 Muslims at prayer, right? So it's this kind of like extremely sensationalistic, misleading kind of conspiratorial reporting, and the inferential meaning, so to speak, of a publication like that is to suggest to people that I support white supremacy, that I sympathize with this ideology, and that's precisely the conclusion that people draw. And you saw that reflected in the subsequent media reports or in the many, many hundreds of abusive, sort of hateful comments that were leveled at me on Twitter. And that's just like, if you talk to me about these ideas, you're welcome to disagree with me and challenge my assumptions. That's the point for me of having these conversations. And but I think you'd find that, that their depiction of me was just utterly, utterly false. Yeah.
And those ideas, I mean, if you take both of them that the press progress piece really focused on, number one, the imbalance or the double standard, if you will, in the treatment of white supremacist violence versus radical Islamic terror violence. And then the other one is the demographic issues. Both of these are debatable. You can object. You can put forward a proposition as you did, and there's an argument to be had there. And both of them have been had in very academic settings without it causing career ruinment. And that's what I find is so dangerous about what happened in this particular round of coverage, is that because you're a candidate and because you're a part of this thing that is being opposed, which in the case of Press Progress was the United Conservative Party in Alberta, you become... it's war. I mean, it's a warfare, really. It's you become a casualty of this battle, and it has nothing to do with you in terms of their motivation. You're just a little fleck that they can hone in on. But on your side, it's entirely personal, and it's your life, and it's your name. And I've been there, which is why I was so interested in your story when this happened the first time around, and why I wanted to speak to you now. And I want to get to the impact that has, that misrepresentation. But I also want to talk about what you're doing about it, because I find this to be something that we don't often hear, is that you're fighting back. And obviously you're not a candidate right now. The election's over, but you've actually served libel notices to Press Progress and to a number of other media outlets. What is it that really spawned that? Because a lot of people would love to just try to move as far away from this chapter of their lives as they could. What's happening?
Yeah. Well, as you know, having gone through it, when you find yourself at the center of this kind of like these online shame storms, Cass Sunstein recently proposed a new word, lapidations, to refer to it, which is sort of a reappropriation of an old world word for public stonings. But when you find yourself at the center of that, I think what a lot of people don't understand is you can't fixate on responding to all these false allegations. You just sort of hold on to what you can and you wait for the storm to pass. I'm also generally disinclined to try to, I guess something about defending myself feels really self-serving, right? Like it's inherently self-serving when you're trying to defend your reputation. And so to some extent, I was almost reluctant to do it. But then a lot of people pointed out to me, and I don't think this is true, but they said, well, if you're not defending yourself, that means you're okay with being thought to be a white supremacist, which means you must really be a white supremacist. And that's, of course, not true. I had one person say, like, you talk a lot about venerating and upholding truth. Well, why don't you then set the record straight when it comes to yourself? And I kind of came around to that perspective that it's true. If you've been unfairly defamed, and I think I've been egregiously defamed, maybe you do have an obligation to truth. And I also think I have an obligation to, my many donors and volunteers, some of whom put in hundreds of hours or the equivalent of hundreds of hours of labor into my campaign, to voters in my constituency who had nominated me in a democratic process to be their candidate and who were essentially robbed of that choice. But I'm doing this, I'm pursuing this claim because I think that what cases like this illustrate is that we're at risk of heading in a pretty dangerous direction with the tone of our political discourse. It's even more egregious, I think, in my case, because basically what they did was they colluded with a person who had, I won't get into it here, but who had an extensive history of trying to harass and intimidate and defame me. A person that no reasonable person would look at this person's history and think they were credible in any way. And they colluded with this person. They mined private conversations, sort of academic conversations where you're often kind of testing ideas, you're playing devil's advocate, you're considering different perspectives. They took a few excerpts out of context, edited them deceptively, presented them deceptively, and tried to ruin my reputation so that they could win a battleground constituency. But there's a chilling effect of that on free inquiry, and it's not just free expression, right? It's on free inquiry itself. You basically sent the message that if you're a public figure of any kind of standing, someone could go into your private correspondences, mine them for evidence of thought crimes, and use that to try to publicly ruin you. If that kind of precedent takes hold, the effect on it, our capacity to understand different issues, to understand different perspectives, to have open, frank, sort of intellectual discussions on sensitive but very important issues, there's a chilling effect on all of that. The worst thing, though, is I think the damage that's done to human relationships when you create a climate where this is acceptable. There can be no trust or frankness or tenderness among people if you're constantly worried that you might be speaking to someone who's going to inform on you, and if you're worried that the media would collude with them to inform on you. So that's a big part of it. It's the erosion of trust and friendship, the kind of attack that Press Progress launched and that a lot of other media outlets very credulously picked up on, has the effect of worsening the polarization in our politics, making people more afraid of each other, more contemptuous of each other. I think we should be trying to tamp down on those tendencies rather than lean into and exploit them. And also, this can happen to anyone. And that's the thing that people miss, right? There's a lot of people who are like, well, I've never said anything bad that can be used against me. If you think that, you're either delusional, or you just have a sort of a very sort of poor imagination, or you're just a really preening bore who's just never had an original thought. But no, it can happen to anyone. And I think it's important that we try to get a hold on these tendencies and find ways to sort of fortify ourselves against it, because otherwise this just spirals out of control.
And it's also important to look at the process here. And I want to focus in on that Press Progress piece as an example, because this is something, and I'm not a lawyer, but there's a legal concept that I believe is called the doctrine of completeness, which is to say that you're going to introduce a paragraph of a document into evidence. That whole document has to be available so you can see the paragraph before, the paragraph after it, and the context. And Press Progress, for its part, says in the story, and I want to pull up this line, the authenticity of the messages was verified independently and original copies of the messages were reviewed in person. So they're acknowledging they've seen the entire conversation. They're acknowledging they've seen the entire context, but that's not what they publish. And you say edited, and we know that they only published a subset of it or an excerpt of it. But if you are going to make a significantly charged claim, like someone is a white supremacist or someone is an apologist for white supremacists, show the methodology, show what it is that has led you to that conclusion. And that's where the real dishonesty is here, is that people will look at one paragraph without seeing that this is part of a longer standing conversation, without seeing that this relationship between you and the tipster in this case was part of a longer standing saga. And all of this is missing. And it's not just where the outlet didn't know, it's that the outlet, by its own acknowledgement, seems to say, we saw the whole thing, but this is all we're showing you. We've decided just these little 3 lines are relevant.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I interpret their statement in the same way. It seems entirely plausible to me that they were presented with just these excerpts and told by their source what they meant and what to infer from them, and believe. I mean, that's the more generous reading. But either way, they're either grossly negligent, or they're actively misleading. So yeah, the deception isn't just in the editing of comments, it's in the omissions, right? It's all the things that are left out, all the statements I made that would have directly contradicted the narrative that they set to tell about me. And then it's also in the additions, right? It's the meanings and associations and interpretations that are read in. And the cumulative effect of that is to invite readers to believe something that is grossly untrue. And I should add, like, I'm not the only person who's harmed by this. My donors and volunteers and voters and my family and friends are not the only people who are harmed by this. They published an article that it essentially invited people to believe that I hate and am contemptuous toward immigrants, toward Muslim communities. This causes pain to those communities. Like, if you've ever had the experience of being hated based on your group identity, it sucks. Like, it's not vindicating to be told that you're hated. It's an incredibly callous thing to do. And so, you know, they cause harm to a whole lot of people with this. And there's just something incredibly cynical about the fact that they're doing this because, as far as I can tell, because I was a strong candidate in a battleground riding.
How does it feel, or how does it impact you to be distilled down to what is really a pawn? Because there's a fundamental rejection of your humanity when these form of attacks come. And I'm not equating that to the type of attacks on groups that you were just talking about a moment ago, but there is still a complete minimization of you as a person when this happens.
Yeah. You turn into a kind of unidimensional villain, right? You're a symbol of evil and of racism and of all of these abhorrent things. And that's the one of the obviously very unfortunate things about this phenomena of kind of online shaming, of trials by social media. There are a lot of problems with them. The kind of the lack of any presumption of innocence or due process or rules of evidence or anything is one big problem. But it's also the disproportionality of the effects is one of the really pernicious things about it. That you have many instances of people who basically, because of one tiny transgression or perceived transgression, will have their careers utterly ruined, careers and reputations that were built over decades, destroyed in hours. Many people who go through this, I don't know what your experience was like, but I've been approached by a lot of people subsequently who went through their own version of this kind of hell. A lot of them developed PTSD, became depressed, their relationships suffer. Some people contemplate suicide, some people do it. So there's an incredible cruelty to this. And the irony is the people who go online to say mean things about strangers on the internet, I don't know what motivates that behavior, like at a personal level. I don't know why you would want to increase the sum of human misery in the world, but no doubt they convince themselves that they're doing something good. You go online to denounce racism and white supremacy, and you think that you're being virtuous. You perform moral outrage to reap certain reputational benefits, but you do it at the expense of a real human being who you've never met, who you don't know. And it allows cruelty and malice to kind of masquerade as virtue. And that's one of the ways I think social media especially it deforms our character. And again, it worsens those tendencies of dehumanizing your political opponents. Yeah.
You have a family. You have a network of friends and supporters and people that backed you. there are people that don't have that. And when you talk about people that contemplate suicide, that go through it, actually, I mean, that I could very easily see, because when you are in the midst of it, and it sounds so odd to say because Twitter is not real life, and we know that Twitter is not an accurate representation of the world, or at least we certainly hope it isn't. But when you're in the midst of it, it actually, for me, and you may have a different take, it has this magnetic draw where even though you know there's nothing you need to see on there, and there's nothing good to see, you can't help but keep checking the mentions. And that was me. I don't know if it was you, but there is something in this that is all consuming in a way. And it's happening online. But that there's also a danger in that, because it follows you everywhere you go. You wake up in the morning, you look at your phone, and oh, my battery's drained because of all these Twitter messages. And how did you deal with that, both during, I mean, the initial firestorm, but even after, because this didn't stop for you once you ceased to be a candidate?
Oh no, no. Yeah, I mean that was the idea. We kind of thought that if I resigned, that they would just move on, but they didn't, right? Like I was front page above the fold like 10 days later, still being held up as an example of, like, I guess, moral rot within the conservative movement or something. Um, I don't have mentions turned on Twitter. I basically stayed off the internet for the first week. I read, finally, like I got
Smarter
to
woman than I am.
I read a bunch of C.S. Lewis and Cicero, and I read the Analects and the, Marcus Aurelius, and like
Hmm.
I hung out with my kids. I went to the park. Like it was actually you remember that real life is very, very different from life online, and it's a better world where you have real people. Where online I was hated and people were afraid of standing up for me. In real life, people I barely knew were coming up to me and giving me hugs and telling me that what a travesty they thought this whole thing was. The problem is that what happens on Twitter doesn't stay on Twitter. It seeps into the real world, right? When you Google my name now, you see associations to
Yeah.
accusations of white supremacy. This will never go away. Um, my career prospects for the rest of my life are maybe irreparably damaged as a result of a defamatory expression by Press Progress. Um, there's this kind of interesting asymmetry in that just as it's easier to destroy something than to create it. You spend decades acquiring sort of a good reputation. You're held in high esteem by your peers, by your colleagues, and it takes hours to destroy it. It takes a few words to make a false accusation against someone, and it might take thousands of words to refute it. And that asymmetry is exploited by people who want to destroy. And unfortunately, the way that our kind of 24-hour news cycle works, our media is not it's not well equipped to handle that asymmetry. Right? They deal in sound bites, not in nuance. You can't publish 1,000-word rebuttal in the newspaper of a 10-word accusation. I got off track there, but I wanted to say that the most devastating thing for me after this, the thing that made me really despondent for a little while, was the realization my background is in international human rights, and I've spent the last more than half my life now working with refugees and asylum seekers, trying to generate awareness and doing research on the persecutions faced by religious and ethnic minorities abroad.
So I just want to jump in on that for just a moment. So you've actually done more for minorities and particularly ethnic communities that the people on Twitter think they're standing up for when they call you a white supremacist.
Um,
You've done real things for these communities.
Yeah. And the thing that made me really upset was, when I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to be certainly not an effective public advocate ever again for any cause that I care about. That was where it's like, well, then what's the point? So
I get that.
And the truth is, you gain perspective and you think, all right, maybe there's something that you can still do. But like I've censored myself multiple times already because I've realized, me speaking out on this issue will not help anymore. So whereas I used to be a great asset to groups that desperately need advocates, I would now be a liability, right? So it's that feeling of, oh man, I've just been made useless to the people that I care about. That's what's really devastating. It is an interesting process, though. You know, when you go through something like this, every once in a while, you start casting about for someone to blame for your situation other than yourself, right? And it's very easy to do. In my case, I think it's quite easy to do. But it's not helpful, right? Like you realize you have to try to figure out a way to be sort of worthy of your suffering, right? You find a way to redeem it somehow so that it's not in vain. And I think there's two chief ways you can do that. You try to better yourself as a person. You let it make you, on the one hand, harder in the sense of tempering you and making you more resilient, but also you let it make you softer and more empathetic and more understanding of other people. And then the other thing you do is you try to use it in a way that it can help others, right? So that's what I try to bear in mind. Like, I'm not doing this because I'm seeking vengeance or something, or at least, like, I hope that's not why I'm doing it. But because I think that left unchecked, the kinds of politics that we're seeing is going to be very damaging to our, to social cohesion, to social trust, to our ability to understand that we can disagree on matters of politics and still be friends and neighbors. That sense of homonoia, of kind of friendship at the level of a polity that binds us together. Those seem to be the things that are at risk, to say nothing of privacy rights, which is another interesting dimension here.
And it's amazing how much we flipped from that vision you just described of having disagreements but being able to be friends and chat, because now we can have agreements, but we'll create these very false reasons to divide. Yeah. And, there are a lot of people, and again, I look at you speaking with the person that ultimately sent these messages to Press Progress in the media. I mean, you had a long-standing disagreement with this person about a number of topics, but you discussed. You had a working relationship. It went sour. And again, we can read about that in the piece you've written on the subject. But, something flips, and now you can just say the wrong word, express the wrong thought, and people that were your friends become your enemies, or people that at the very least were in agreement with you on a lot of issues will turn. And we saw that we see that in elections. We see that in elections where, whether out of political expediency or out of maybe a genuine misguidedness, people will throw candidates under the bus. And in your case, the remarks are not defended, they're denounced. So this idea of it's easy just to say, yes, she shouldn't have said that, it's wrong, she's resigned, than to stand up for something. And that creates a very dangerous precedent, because it means it's easier to go along with the lie than to stand up for the truth.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think the reason for that is what we were discussing earlier, that in the heat of an election, especially, you don't have time, and I don't think that you have the kind of the goodwill from the media, especially if you're conservative, to be able to say, like, well, let's have a kind of a serious discussion about an issue. Mm-hmm. Do it sort of charitably, in good faith. It's going to take a long time to do that. And you don't have time to do that when you're dealing with sort of very rapid news cycles where headlines dominate, where the Solzhenitsyn once said something about how, in his Harvard address, he's talking about the freedom we have in the West and the ways that we kind of abuse that freedom. And he targeted the press in particular. He said something like, hastiness and superficiality are the great psychic diseases of the 20th century, and nowhere more evident in the press. It's hard to communicate complex ideas on morally fraught topics in a few words. But yeah, the consequence of that is, like, it creates this kind of anti-discourse, right? Where you almost can't discuss the substance of an idea. You can only talk about it through kind of empty rhetoric and associations. And the irony is, when I was door knocking, I mean, I knocked on, I don't know how many thousands of doors over 9 months campaigning. People hate this. Like real people absolutely abhor what has happened to the quality of our political discourse, that it's been so badly dumbed down, that it's impossible to have, yeah, to have this recognition that, okay, like we share an objective, let's actually look at the evidence to see how we can get there. Instead, it's these sort of emotionally loaded but substantively empty accusations that you hurl at your opponents. Real voters hate this, and that's kind of the frustrating thing. Is like something about the way that media often conducts itself seems anti-democratic, in the sense that they can sort of strip, right? Like I won't, maybe I shouldn't go too far down that path, but there's something about the way that elections are frequently, the media sort of puts their thumb on the scale, not just on one side, but for a sort of style of discussing issues that is not what most people actually want.
No, and that's a fascinating point, because I remained a candidate through and after the firestorm that existed around me. And
Yeah.
to be honest, canvassing was actually the greatest tool in keeping me sane, because I was
Yeah.
reminded that real people are so far removed from this. And I think that in the time that I was knocking on doors after this, I probably heard about it from two or three people and
Yeah.
had some very reasonable conversations with them about it, where I actually felt like, if I can get this one person to see me as a human, it means I could get everyone else. And of course, the reality is that you can't cover as much ground as you would like to in these things. But you are very correct that people, real people, are distinct from this amorphous mass that is
Yeah.
people in a group on the internet. And I guess, and I know this is a big question, but what is it that causes real people to become that when they get behind a computer? And if you don't have an answer, that's fine. But I know you've had certainly some time to think about it. And why wouldn't you think about it when this has been so central to your life this year?
Well, it's a good question. You might have insights on that too. Why do people become like that on the computer? Obviously, the kind of the anonymity of it is part of it. Right? George Orwell wrote about this, when he fought the fascists and Franco's during the Spanish Civil War, and he wrote about how like he just he wanted to kill fascists, and then he saw the real people in front of him who were he had difficulty conceiving of them as this kind of they were no longer a symbol of evil, they were human beings. And something about when you're face to face with people, you're incentivized to want to understand them, to find common ground, to be sensitive to them, to be empathetic. And when you strip that away, when you lose the face-to-face, obviously it's much easier to view people as kind of caricatured abstractions, right? As embodying ideas rather than as humans. Part of it, though, there's some weird dimension of group psychology, though, where, and I was reading a study about this recently, that when let's say you have a jury and they're trying to decide on a case, and one or two people in the jury might speak up favoring extremely harsh or extremely lenient perspectives, and the role that has in shifting the whole group in that direction is really, really substantial. So if you have a couple people who are very, very vocal, I think it creates it sort of creates this polarization, and people become more extreme. There's also something about, I think on Twitter, because it's sort of like a faceless mass. If you want to stand out and if you want to claim among your peers, you do that by taking more and more extreme positions. You become the loudest person in the room, denouncing someone as a white supremacist or whatever. I think that just the whole incentive structure of it works in a way that sort of like militates against human heartedness and moderation. The more disturbing thing to me, though, and I think I found this disturbing, I think partly because a lot of my background academically came in studying totalitarian regimes and looking at the psychology that arises in those contexts, was huge numbers of people reached out to me privately, expressing often very eloquently and in heartfelt ways that how saddened they were by what happened to me, how outraged they were by what happened. And very few of those people were prepared to say so publicly, or they weren't in a position to say so publicly. So people became afraid of expressing their true thoughts because they were afraid that the online mob would turn on them, not without reason, because that actually did happen. So it's that when you sort of humiliate people and you intimidate them to a point where they're not willing to stand up for what they know is right or what they know is true. That's kind of the really disturbing thing about it. Sorry, I'm talking about this in a really kind of circuitous way, but the effect of this is to demoralize people. You make them unwilling to stand up for what they actually believe. You kind of force them sometimes to say things they don't believe, so that they can avoid reputational harm. And I think there are some activists who would say that that's a victory, that if you can silence people who sympathize with the bad person, then you've won something, which is insane to me. I mean, what you've done is cowed them. You've made them into cowards. You've demoralized and emasculated them, and sort of removed their sort of sense of moral probity or their standing to resist you. I don't think that's a victory. There's no moral substance in what you've done. You've just made people afraid. That's not the kind of society I think we should be trying to build.
No, and in my case, I couldn't help but internalize that toxicity and start viewing myself in those terms of just, yes, I should stay away from going to this event because I don't want that organization to have to deal with my grief, or I should go and it took a little while for me, long after the election, to get back from that and start saying, I'll leave it in someone else's court. If they don't want to be around me, that's their problem, and that's not mine. But this thing does linger with you. And I know that is now a cliche to say, what you post on the internet stays there, and what's posted about you stays there. But there is a significant risk to that we be defined, and you mentioned this a couple of moments ago, as caricatures. Because, I mean, in my case, look, I was a radio host. I talked for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 5 years. And there were ample opportunities in that time for people to define me by what I was saying, but instead it was, let's define you by 140 characters from 9 years ago. And this is the whole thing. In your case as well, you've had dozens and dozens of these conversations with this person. You have a body of work to speak of. You have were being heralded as a star candidate. Jason Kenney was doing videos with you. And then let's distill her down to this simple caricature. And the irony in all of this is that the people who are mobbing are reducing themselves to caricatures, because it could just as easily be turned back on them and said, well, hang on, you're a person. I saw one man, and I wrote about this, who told me I should go and hang myself, and very graphic in his description of it. And for whatever reason, that day I decided I was going to look him up. And I see him on his Facebook picture with a button-down shirt, a tie, and a beautiful, beautiful young boy on his knee. And I'm like, how can you square these two images? This father, and then this guy telling a perfect stranger to go and hang himself from a tree. And this needs to be broken down with face-to-face conversations. Yeah. But there's also an element of, I don't want anything to do with you people that are saying this about me. And have you had the opportunity to come in the last few months face-to-face with people that were critics of yours and said, let's have a conversation about this? Or have you had any interest in that?
I'm really, I mean, my problem is that I think I get myself into trouble sometimes because I'm very curious about ideas. Like it's the thing that animates me most, right? So when people are disagreeing with me, my inclination is always to say like, let me try to figure out how, and what are the assumptions that you're basing this on?
You still have this grand romantic idea that the idea will win out at the end of the day.
Well, yeah, and that trying to find truth truth often through sort of actually testing your assumptions and ideas with other people. Like this to me is the whole point. This is what I like doing. That, by the way, is one of the more treacherous things about what this anonymous source had done. Was like, I would often come to these conversations saying like, hey, the evidence I've seen on X issue leads me to a given conclusion. I think I may be missing something. Help me figure out what perspectives I have failed to account for, right? you'd often approach conversations as a devil's advocate, where you're actively trying to inhabit the perspective of a person other than yourself. To take stuff out of context, like in that setting, and then try to pretend that that's like representative of someone's whole, like, the fact is, I don't really have a lot of very firm opinions on a lot of these topics. I'm interested in just exploring them. That's the appeal. So anyway, so no, I've tried reaching out to a couple of people who evidently thought that I deserved, at least to some extent, what happened to me, and some of them who were actually, I think, quite a bit kinder, right? So some people, when I talk about the mob, I mean the really senseless stuff, right? Just the pilings on and the sort of open talk and derision, right? I'm not talking about the people who at least tried to be more thoughtful in their critiques. I tried reaching out to some of those people and saying, like, well, let's have a real conversation about this, because if I'm wrong about something, I really want to understand what it is. That was the frustrating thing. I had all these people demanding that I apologize. And it's like, well, people who demand public apologies, I don't understand why you do that. A compelled apology has no moral substance. It has no redemptive value. You're basically, if you're asking someone to apologize for their real or perceived beliefs, you're engaging in an act of cruel, sort of degrading dominance. You're not changing their mind. You're not trying to explain why they should apologize. So I tried reaching out to some people saying, like, what is it that I said that was wrong? And what I found was that most people had just assumed that they had inferred meanings in my words that weren't there, right? Obviously, and I think that was Press Progress's intention with the way they wrote their story. So most of what I got was kind of straw man arguments. It said, well, it's wrong just to think this. And say, well, I don't think that. Well, what about this? And I said, yeah, I mean, I accounted for that in the next comment that I made that was not published. So most of it was just that people had failed to understand what I actually think and believe, because they didn't have any further context, because they had never talked to me about these issues before. Some people, though, I did get some interesting perspectives, though, where some people just said, well, you cannot, even in private, talk about demographic transition in Europe because white nationalists also talk about it, and you cannot escape that sort of the context, the sort of the moral context, like the meaning of what you're saying cannot be separated from the broader moral context.
That was that logical fallacy I think I learned about in high school of, Hitler was a vegetarian, Hitler was a Nazi, ergo vegetarians are Nazis. I mean, it's so shallow, but this is the climate that we're in now, where people say, no, you can't do this thing because these people do it. And we see this with, you see it with symbology a lot of the time. I know that apparently some white nationalists have flown Canada's former flag, the red ensign. So now there's a group to say that, no, the red ensign is a white nationalist symbol. And people are prepared to cede the meanings and words and symbols and stories to all of these reprehensible groups. And I think that in and of itself is where you get into the free speech element of this, of people trying to preemptively or proactively take certain things off the table. And, free speech is not just about the right to speak without being censored by the government. We also have to look at the cultural aspects here. And I would say that trying to destroy someone's life because they said something is an anti-free speech position. And the one thing you hear often is that free speech is not consequence-free speech, which I agree with, but you have two elements there. You've got the proportionality and also the idea of having honest and frank discussions. And I wanted to put that to you because there are a lot of people that would say you had the right to speak freely. The backlash was all just the consequences of that, so you shouldn't complain. And I don't agree with that, but I know people are going to say it, especially with you initiating this libel notice. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that. What do you say back to those people that are going to be putting that ridiculous claim to you?
Well, I mean, first, again, this is where a distinction between private and public speech is important. Right? There are some things that I would be very reluctant to talk about publicly because I'm not confident that I've come to the right conclusions about them. and because I recognize that they're very sensitive. And so, I think it's that doesn't mean that you can't privately have an interest in these things and sort of want to understand them. But I do think that there are some issues where it's incumbent upon you to tread a little more carefully and to exercise more prudence. And so, and also obviously, when you're taking a couple sentences out of context of a broader conversation and then saying that you deserve to be punished because we've misunderstood what you said, it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just ridiculous to me. But yeah, no, of course there are consequences to speech, and that's Press Progress will face the consequences of their speech in a court of law rather than in this sort of in a trial by public opinion. You'd said something earlier that I wanted to pick back up on, though. It was you'd said something about the logical fallacy. Now, the problem that I have with people who say, well, you cannot talk about this sort of social fact because other people talk about that fact. It's an interesting thing. And now I can be persuaded on this, that they maybe have a point, but one, I think it's really unhelpful. So the other day I was looking for something in Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, and I've noticed something that I hadn't really noticed before, which is the importance that she places on the fact of the sort of making something forbidden knowledge greatly increases its appeal. So, and that's something that can be exploited by demagogues and by dangerous people. So if you try to suppress discussion of something that is sort of an objective social reality, and try to prohibit people from talking about it and its effects, you're not the intention may be good, but I don't think that works. Actually, I think it makes people much more susceptible to manipulation by people who come along and sort of purport to be willing to break taboos and talk about the forbidden knowledge. I think that probably accounts for some aspect of Trump's popularity, right? So that's part of my problem with this is, insofar as people think that you should suppress discussion of certain objective realities because you're afraid of where it will go, so you're suppressing discussion on kind of consequentialist grounds. I just don't think this is an effective way of achieving the objectives. I think it's the opposite. And we could get into a very long discussion about the evidence that leads me to that conclusion. But yeah, the other thing is, like, it's striking how a lot of the people who targeted me, I don't want to be too harsh, but it's as though they were never taught to think clearly, right? It's like, I wonder if, like,
I don't think that's being too harsh. I think that's being entirely reasonable here.
Well, I mean, because to me, if you want to understand the truth of a thing, you break it down into its component parts, right? You examine underlying assumptions and premises. You establish the facts sort of step by step. And instead, it seems as though people will sort of look at something and say, well, that's like this thing, which is like this thing, and therefore A equals D. And, it's an attempt to try to sort of make evidence fit a given worldview and conform to prejudices rather than being able to look at it dispassionately. And, like, on the one hand, I understand, like, in your daily life, look, if you're walking down the street and you see, a big red aluminum box on the sidewalk, you're probably going to think, oh, that's a mailbox, right? And you have all sorts of associations and meanings that are wrapped up in that. You know that people can put letters in there and eventually a mailman will come and pick it up and deliver them. And these kinds of associations are really, really useful in navigating the world, right? They make living efficiently possible, that you don't have to, every time you encounter something, you don't have to sort of re-examine everything about it. But in the course of an argument whose purpose is to achieve an understanding of what is true, you actually have to unlearn those tendencies. You have to stop your mind from forming associations that are not supported by the evidence. And you kind of have to strip away that extraneous context and associations and meanings and look at the thing just for what it is. But I think people haven't been taught how to do that. They're actually encouraged to go about, like, making these associations to infer all sorts of things. So yeah, that's a problem, I guess.
Yeah, and it gets to that performative nature of Twitter and social media, that it's more advantageous to express the idea, even if it's completely not a fleshed out idea in 180 or 280 characters now, than it is to engage in longer form and by extension to consume in longer form, which is
Yeah.
where it's easy. I mean, the fact that someone would read a text and not feel in them, I want to read everything before I comment. I mean, that in and of itself is where you talk about that ability to think. And I think we should probably do a part two at some point because there's a lot in this. But I want to bring it back just in closing here. We've talked about the legal action you've initiated, but where do you go personally? I mean, you and I both are in the same boat in that we have to live with a misrepresentation, until the end of time. And I know you've talked in some capacities about wanting to really speak up, not just in your own defense, but in defense of this idea that you want to bring back. But where do you go from here personally? Where does Caylan Ford go?
Um, it's a little bit up in the air. I had one very kind person after this who had been through something similar. Um, the advice he gave me is, go back to your core competencies, right? And so for me, I thought, well, what am I good at and what do I enjoy? And it's writing. I've had a background in documentary writing too, and so I thought, well, I'll write a book, and I'll make a documentary. And you sort of have to hustle a little bit. You can't expect other people to hand you opportunities. There are a lot of people out there, I think, who are inclined to help, but you have to make something happen for yourself, as you're doing, and as I'm trying to do. So yeah, I'm writing a book about. It's actually, if you'd asked me a year ago what I would write a book about, it's actually the same topic, but now it's sort of anchored in a personal experience.
It's more of a
Which is like,
memoir than a bird's eye view now.
yeah, I've kind of compared it to like a combination of John Ronson's "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" and Le Goutkos' "The Demon in Democracy," so which is about as he said, the totalitarian temptations in free societies. So, so that's kind of a fun project. And in the meantime, yeah, you reconnect with friends, with your family, and yeah, we'll see where we go. And then in the meantime, yeah, pursuing this claim against Press Progress and potentially against the NDP as well, because I think they may share liability in this case. That's pretty time consuming.
Well, I am glad you are not taking it lying down, because this is something that you mention effectively and accurately. Everyone suffers from when this becomes the norm and it goes unchallenged. So thank you very much for standing up for yourself and for other people that are going to be in this crosshairs. And thank you for chatting today. Kalyn Ford, really appreciate it.
Thank you.